This is a preview of The Ancient Gift. It is available on all podcast platforms. Just click the link in the description to watch the entire episode now. Welcome back to The Ancient Gift. Your host is October Holland. I'm Chris Matthew, and I will be introducing her guests today. First, Susan Bradford. She is a writer, author, and public speaker who provides commentary and analysis on foreign policy, realpolitik, and agendas of the deep state. Her books are dedicated to pulling back the curtain on corruption within government and financial institutions to help restore integrity to the republic. She has written and ghostwritten many books and articles and appeared on the BBC, podcasts, radio programs, and a documentary on the Great Reset. Next, we have Andreas Exertus. Since the age of 11, he was working in Silicon Valley cleaning analog to digital recordings. He is a nanotechnology metamaterial scientist, and he did graphene and stoichiometric indexing at NASA, social media strategy at CNN, and he also worked for the Peruvian government in the Amazon for bioremediation of pollution. And finally, we have Ari Aslan. He is a hobbyist conspiracy researcher who explores alternate truth topics such as Saturnian cosmology, electric universe theory, mud flood and reset theory, and life on Mars. He also studies predictive programming in the media and how it may be decrypted to determine which truths are forbidden to us and which falsehoods have been pushed as truth. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. And this is Ari, Susan, and Andreas. And we are going to be talking about the Tartarian history, or Tartaria. And it's a subject that I've just discovered actually in the last few months. I'm a historian myself, and I am completely enthralled and fascinated by it. I have been fortunate enough to be a guest host with Chris Matthew on Forbidden Knowledge News, and I have co-hosted a show with Susan Bradford and with Ari as well. And I'm really looking forward to having Andreas join us today, and all four of us talk about this amazing subject that not a lot of people know or have any idea about. I myself am, in the infancy of research and trying to discover and unpack what this is and what this means to us today, and why it might be really important for us to understand what this does mean, and why, where we are today and how this impacts our daily life. So the first thing I want to do is give the floor to Ari and ask him to give us a, not a short, but let's say a shortened version of what you feel, where Tartarians started, and very importantly as well, I've heard you talk about time and how we view time and how that impacts not just our present day existence, but our history as well. So if you want to take the floor, Ari, and give us your, your version of Tartaria and present day, I would love to hear it.
Absolutely. Let's see, I started researching Tartaria and alternate modern history only about 2 years ago, when I stumbled on Anatoly Fomenko. And he's just the guy to know about this. He's in the center of a lot of this research. He's the most involved research, has a lot of references right there in the Vatican. I'm sorry, not Vatican, the Kremlin, where he did a lot of his studies. And with Russia, that's actually the place you got to start. If you're going to talk about Tartaria, you got to talk about modern day Russia. It's a place that had a recent USSR fell apart, and then recently they've sort of been trying to piece themselves back together, and they've revealed all this alternate history, specifically Tartaria and Tartarian maps. And they did all this in around 2014, 2012. So why is this country, Russia, releasing all this stuff now? Why not, 100 years ago when they're at the height of their USSR empire? The answer to that is, if you look at current events today, like what's happening with Ukraine, you see that there are actually two narratives. The Western narrative, the one that says Kremlin-backed separatists are causing a false flag attack, and then Russia's moving in, taking advantage. And then the Kremlin's own news agency and similar ones that say, no, nothing like that. Don't worry, it's nothing like that. And of course, we say they're lying, and we've always said they're lying. So this goes back before the 2000s, of course, in the 90s, when we've seen a lot of Russia phobia in movies and the news. And before that, we had the Cold War, when we thought, we're supposed to be at war with this country. And before that, World War II, we're allies with them. So there's a very significant sort of info war occurring with Russia between the West and the remnants of the East. And I'll say remnants because what Russia is telling us is that there was this place, Great Tartaria, which spanned far beyond just what we know of Russia today, throughout Siberia and into the Americas. But actually, it was a world empire at the time. And so Anatoly Fomenko gives us a foundation for this in text, and in all of our texts, actually, from the holy texts to the secular ones. And for me personally, I need something grounded, something that can be proven in a lab, not magic, nothing that we have to believe in with faith. All of this stuff has to be verifiable. So if I'm going to talk about rewriting history or proof of rewriting history, it's a very delicate subject. We have to ascertain motive and the actors who actually did it. And it really helps, again, to research Fomenko, who points out specifically that was Romanovs and a lot of their co-ops in the Tartarian Empire, that as it fell apart, as to the West, they took the history of Tartaria with them, the religion, the sciences, all of it, and just said, you guys didn't invent this stuff. You guys never existed. We invented this stuff. England, France, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, all these new locations, which today we believe represent the actual history. So again, there's two versions of history, East and West, and it is possible that the one that we've been taught our whole lives was something that the victors of World War II wrote because they were the victors, because they were able to do that. And before that, the victors of the 1812 World War, they were able to rewrite history as well. So we know who they are. We know when they're able to do this. And it's just a huge puzzle piece that we got fit together. And my position is to not allow magic and mysticism to enter into the hypothetical equations that we're trying to write down. We've got to try to stay grounded and refer back to Scalgerian timelines that we are now doubting. We have to refer to them. If we stop, we get lost. And so I do refer to Scalgerian timeline, 19th century, we're living in the 21st century, and so forth. And that's more or less a summary.
Well, you quit really fast on me.
Okay.
I wasn't prepared to hit unmute there. Okay, so as a historian, I have a ton of questions. The first one I want to say, you just said, okay, so you're saying that Russia is basically the world empire of Tartaria, that they're basically the one who holds the real history and the empiric world control. Do you think that's why the Czar and his family were murdered? Was to reset it so that they could erase them like off of the face of the earth basically, and the Bolshevik revolution then kicked off, and then with in line with World War I and then World War II with the conflict of Germany and Russia, because Russia kind of flipped sides in both wars. Do you think that that's why that happened, that the Tsar and his family were murdered, basically to get rid of any living proof of Tartaria?
Well, I believe that the cover-up went further back after the 1812 war. That's when they actually tried to cover all this stuff up. And in the 19th century, in the 20th century, when we saw the aristocracy of Russia get murdered, we also saw the aristocracy of other European countries get murdered all at the same time to trigger World War I, actually in the middle of it.
Right.
So it was an attempt to take them all out at the same time and put England as the only reigning monarch in this planet, because England seems to think that they have the memory of going all the way back to the first king in history. The entire history of Tartaria has been translated into the history that we accept today of England. And because of that, England survives as the only monarch in the world, because they are the fakest of all monarchs in the world.
Well, I mean, from my understanding, and I would have to look this up, but what I understand is that all monarchies are related with bloodlines.
Yeah.
That goes back to the original 12 kings of Babylon, right? Or Sumerian. And that
they like to believe that, yes, absolutely.
And there are reigning monarchs still in the world. There's Thailand, I believe. There's Saudi Arabia still has, a monarch.
Right.
So, but I understand.
Let me clarify. These are also fake. Yeah.
You're saying that they're the only empiric bloodline left, that they still, reign in the world. And I understand that. So what was interesting to me too, you said that World War II, we were allies in Russia, but no, not at first, right? In World War II, because Germany, Hitler went to Stalin and they made a little secret pact. So Germany wouldn't invade the border of Russia because they were, basically struggling at that time with resources and population, correct? So it's interesting to me. And of course, when Germany did invade, then that pact was, null and void. And then we came in and helped. Obviously, we all know what happened in World War II. But what is your thoughts on that? Why would Russia a flip-flop? And how does that impact the story of Tartaria? Like how does World War I, World War II, and present day politics, like hey, you had mentioned the Ukraine, really impact the story of Tartaria and why it's so guarded, why they don't want us to know?
Absolutely. The Tartarian Empire allegedly fell apart in 1775, 1 year before America declared independence. Why did America do that? Because the empire had fallen apart and there was a power vacuum worldwide. Now, not every country declared independence. Many regions wanted to stay part of this world empire. So the War of 1812 in this way mimics exactly what Hitler did when he allegedly made a pact with Russia. When Hitler made a pact with Russia and then invaded Russia, this mirrors exactly when Napoleon made peace terms with Russia before invading. Both Napoleon and Hitler lost in Russia and Siberia. Both campaigns ended there. What we're seeing is basically the history repeating itself as the old Tartarian Empire, which only ended then, was trying to be replaced essentially by either independent countries, which already knew how to rule themselves because they're vassal to that old empire, like America. Here in America, we said we already have laws and colonies and all of it. We don't need anything else. We just need a Declaration of Independence, and that's it. But places like Japan, England, allegedly Australia, all these places did not declare independence. And they in China, they kept all their royal buildings. And it's in this moment when they, instead of declaring independence from the old empire, they pretended that old empire did not exist and that they actually themselves represented the pieces of that old empire as it used to exist. China with their style buildings, England with their castles and so forth, which extend all the way through Canada, by the way. And it's unexplainable how a British colonist could possibly build those kinds of parliament-style buildings throughout Canada when they're actually afraid of a revolution occurring. But I won't even get into that. All of these contradictions are actually very simply solved once you realize the breakup of the Tartarian Empire was 1775, left behind this huge mess.
Okay. I do want to mention something. I have seen world maps back in, I'm going to say like the 14th, 15th century that shows Antarctica as a jungle, right? And then we see modern, obviously, maps with Antarctica as a huge iceberg, basically, or ice continent. So I find that very interesting that it seems like our history is rewritten, for centuries over and over again. And nobody has an explanation of why it would be a jungle, because even if you looked at the timeline that we're in now, let's say a year is 365 days, like they say now, and things are millions or billions of years old, and we've been around for hundreds of thousands of years. Let's just say that timeline, it still wouldn't explain how Antarctica, according to our modern day science, would be a jungle for a year, right? But 400 years ago, it took a lot longer from it to go from a jungle to an iceberg. So I always find that super interesting when we look back at history, that it's, not all of it what it seems or what we've been told. So Susan, right. I'd like to bring you in on the conversation and ask you. So Ari's got a lot of great details and research on the history of Tartaria, but you focus more, I think, on the modern, effects and what this all means for us today and what's really going on kind of behind the scenes in politics. And I'd like to hear, in the last couple hundred years, what you think.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that Ari laid a fantastic foundation, and I can actually build upon that and maybe fill in a few holes. Now, he mentioned that this information came out in 2013. That was the year, I believe, that the Federal Reserve was rechartered under the IMF. which in turn is controlled by the United Nations. And that if you understand world politics, you would know that the world corporations, like the world, is actually controlled by the Vatican. The Vatican holds the Golden Trust, and they contract with each government. The governments are the corporations, and in turn, the corporations are controlled by the Rothschilds. So he said Ari mentioned some very key dates: 1776, 1812, 1776. This was the American Revolution when the Rothschilds, essentially, with the Venetian bankers, their Venetian merchants, were financing both sides of the war to separate the colonies from the monarch, put both in their debt, and then to control both of them, like just, to establish a new government with controlling both of them. 1812, the year before 1812, the charter for our central bank had expired, and so they needed another war to get, to reinstate the financial control over the United States. That was one of the key reasons driving the War of 1812. And I look at Tartaria kind of much the same way. It does come into, it goes back into Russia. And the reason this has been hidden is that Tartaria is really, you'll find the origins of the Rothschilds in the deep state, where the Rothschilds, the financial dynasty, collaborated with the Jesuits, with the Vatican, building upon strategies based upon Confucianism, based upon ancient Asian logic and the Greek Aristotelian logic, to come up with a philosophical framework that allowed them to conquer nations. So they had worked for centuries, essentially consolidating the world's wealth and power within their own hands. And Ari had mentioned how there's only really one chief monarchy left. There are a few other others around, but the British monarchy, and that was due to the fact that that the Vatican, working with the Rothschilds, they fomented wars based on Confucianism against the reigning monarchs who held the divine right to rule, which was established by Jesus Christ. And once they were usurped, they would establish a republic in their place. Those republics would be controlled by them. They would have access to the purse. And then from there, they could have the government finance their commercial enterprises and establish monopolies. So once they were able to breed themselves into the British monarchy, which they did after the Napoleonic Wars, they crashed the stock market. That gave them breeding rights into the British royal family for 200 years under Queen Victoria. They then bred themselves into other royal families throughout the world, including in Russia. That enabled them to control those royal families, and then they eventually fomented wars and revolutions to overthrow them and then install like a Rothschild style republic that appeared on the surface to be democratic, but which was really controlled by them, behind the scenes. So that's maybe a bit of a framework, kind of filling in a few of the holes that.
So the Rothschilds, from my understanding, are a Jewish family, correct? The origins.
I would I'm not really sure they do identify with Judaism, and they did establish Israel, but they are aligned with the Vatican, which is Jesuit. And if you go back into ancient Central Asia, they identify with Confucianism, and they could even be considered Khazarian. And the Khazarian Jews were those they were like a bloodthirsty tribe that was told under penalty of death that you have to convert to one of the three Abrahamic faiths. And if you don't, we'll have to, do away with you because of how vicious and immoral they were. And they chose Judaism for the simple reason that the Muslims had their Ummah, the Christians had the Vatican, they had the divine right to rule, their monarchs. The Jews were the only people who did not have their kingdom but would have one to come. So they identified with Jews for that purpose, so they could then establish their kingdom on earth.
Well, I just found this. Yeah, my understanding of the Rothschilds is that they have a Jewish origin, and that when you said that they align with the Vatican and they're controlled through the Vatican, and which controls the world, basically, it just kind of struck me. Well, that's kind of funny if they're Jewish. That there's a
that's a very good question.
A little bit, conflict or a different paradigm there.
There's
so
no
it's
way
kind
for
of.
the
Go ahead, Andreas.
Just to clarify, so the banking system is run by the Vatican World Bank, and the Knights Templar had laws according to the biblical rules of Leviticus that trading could not have interest lending for Christians. Muslims had similar legislation. So during the Khazarian Caliphate, Maimonides, who was a Jewish doctor and scholar and administrator of the Muslim state of what was Spain and Netherlands and Persia, this is a lot larger of a place. They would allow for people who consider themselves to be part of this particular caste of rabbinical scholars. And there's a lot more to it, obviously, than what we understand as religious. Academically, there's more there too. But they were the only ones permitted to bank. So when people become anti-Semitic against bankers, it should be, and as someone raised Catholic, I'm not saying the same thing against Jesuits, but the Vatican Bank was the one to permit banking systems. So the origin has to go with the Catholic Church.
It's interesting. It's an interesting background you have there. What is that? It looks like a school, like a military school for young people.
Oh, this is a foundling orphanage in Spain that was used to recruit orphans and train them after the reset.
And actually Ari has talked about this too. And I actually know somebody who a relative was sent over on a boat to Australia about 60, 70 years ago, and they were an orphan.
When you start looking into the Bach saga, you'll see that pretty much everyone who doesn't have a royal lineage has been picked up and moved at some point or another. Orphanages, a lot of the time the Catholic Church would say, we can't have inbreeding in the inner cities. We need to take 100,000 of these kids and move them to another city and trade them, swap them with another orphanage somewhere else.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, then there's also orphan trains, because you have measles, you have flus, you have a lot of interesting biological warfare, and you have people losing the ability of fertility for all sorts of reasons that might seem even beyond what can accept, but they did. And when this happened, they would say, hey, on Thursday, the foundling trains will show up in your town. Come grab some kids. So yes, the amount of people who around the ages of 3 to 12 were completely forced to learn a new language, forget everything they know, is something more like a fraction of 70% of the society, of all of civilization.
They had to learn a Latin language.
Let me ask.
And that's another interesting thing, is that people from Canada were sent to Russia, right? So it's not just one way or another. And this idea that things were completely Russian, it's a very important thought, but it's also like these things were very Chinese. Russia and China are two modern empires that have divided on the land of what is the remnant scraps of what was Tartaria. And do
you think that the relationship, and I know this is, and I'm just pulling this out of the air, but they both ended up communists. Do you think that's a coincidence? I know Russia's really not.
So Russia and China were the last nations to centralize their states' banks, right? So if you think of it as the most wealth centralization at once possible. And a big thing is it's not so much about which was the last, but also look at which was the first. Look at the 17 colonies. When Holland was taxed, right? It was essentially centralization of tax for the Habsburg dynasty. So this is the same implementation every step of the way. And you look at India, right? And you look at in America, you'll see the darkest people, who are the most indigenous people, are lower than the slaves brought in to conquer them. And then there's the mercenaries, who are from another land, who have just been conquered. So what happens is you build this caste system where the most immediate people are at the lowest, and the newest people who are bringing this new culture are incentivized to replace the old culture. So there's very little left in certain ways, but in other ways, you can, for instance, you can find picked words in the kitchen, because those are the last places those words were allowed to be uttered. You'll hear, what in tarnation, or you've got tar on your teeth, or the tar baby. And there's a lot of interesting things that have shown up from tar.
Which we associate with black baby. That's what that was.
Well, and that's another.
That's what I'm saying, because
there were black people in the Western Hemisphere that already had been part of this trade, and that's another important aspect. I don't think it's fair to call this an ethno state, like to say that the Tartaria was Russian or Chinese, because it was a confederation of trade. This is what anthropologists have found and lost and found again over and over again, is that eventually war is not good for society. It's something that happens after after scarcity epidemics, which is usually out of a collapse or a crisis. So imagine that you have an advanced civilization that loses its ability to feed its people, kind of like what the World Economic Forum and the banks of the Roman computer have simulated will happen now. If a bunch of people can't eat at once, it's not just a small drop, it's an immediate drop of billions of people, perhaps. And we talk about the plagues, biological warfare, volcanoes, things that would have, both removed all energy and stability and infrastructure, but also would have completely devastated agriculture. And this would have left this endless summer trade system vulnerable to people who had once been paid mercenaries for this system of pirating. Trade has to go through pirating waters because this is an international anarchy. You have a system where if you go through someone else's area, you have highway robbers and barons who used to collect taxes, and now they're going to start stealing from people who just come through their property. So you see the collapse, but it's a very Orwellian collapse because we call it the Dark Ages, when it was the age of enlightenment, really, because this was the Muslim expanding of Tartaria, where the information from ancient Tartaria was becoming popular. Algebra was becoming popular. This kinds of information. I mean, if you went to Cordoba in the 11th century, they had water wheels that spun to make electricity to have lights. And this is accounted for by thousands of travelers who visited Cordoba. So clearly we have marvels that were freaking out people that were also at the same time separate from that culture. And then you see the Irish porters who start to smuggle out or get taxed trading books, because what else can you give me when you're trading to Italy from the Byzantine Empire collapsing from their plague? So all of this, these stories that you hear, there's, I think Ari's made the point that they are Pepsi stories. This is Hallmark Channel. None of these stories are exactly the way. There was no valiant guy who didn't sin and all. There's a lot of the Romanov family. You got a giant, right? What was his name? Sokolov or Yakov. He had bone disease, and his daughter Anastasia married into the Romanov, creating the Romanov dynasty. But they're likely descendant of giants. Most of these 13 royal families, and there are Caribbean royal families, African royal families, the Japanese royal families, they all have the story that they descend from dragons. The only ones who don't are the pre-Theodorans, who are so the Saxons all say they descend from the gods, but then the Merovingian line say they do not. So there is a period there of this sort of Blackwater surplus army troop wearing gangsters, like what was going on in the Ukraine for the last 10 years, running around France, running around Italy, telling people that they were in charge and that and this usurped what had been the natural order of things up until the aqueducts were cut, up until people were no longer able to read and they were no longer able to proliferate the culture. And so there is a shattering that happens, but the shattering isn't incidental. It's completely planned. And you can see, when you're talking about, I think Susan's talking about the Illuminati in some variety or another, there are groups of people that want to organize and to proliferate their agenda, right? To procure a world order that is stable, because what's the point of running the world if it's not stable?
Well,
so Freemasons and Rosicrucians, and then they start fighting. And so the Rosicrucians are in Germany, and the Freemasons, they come from, the Order of Light out of Italy into Scotland, and they start thinking that that's the new Jerusalem. But the Russians are, they think that Moscow is the new Jerusalem. So here's the deal. You have nomadic people that are leaving after they've destroyed their city because of some sort of a mud flood, and they go out places and they try to rebuild that city with the same people and call it Jerusalem, but they split up and they go in different places. And so that's why you have Herodotus calling things Atlantis, because a number of examples of these star fort city-states, and this is the biggest thing about Tartaria, you will find evidence through star forts, because everywhere you go in the world, there are remnants of these Atlantis-like autonomous city-states that would allow for water, electricity, and infrastructure.